Right, good morning everybody and welcome to the CFE webinar, Accessing versus Generating Research Data, Exploring the Range of Options. Today is September 29th and my name is Deepa Sriram and I am the host for this webinar representing the Center for Faculty Excellence. We do have our presenters here who will take you through this entire webinar, but before they get started, I do have a couple of housekeeping things that I wanted to go over with you. And the first thing is that you will see a variety of documents placed on this main screen here that you see. It is a PowerPoint presentation. And there are also some other pods that are available, and they'll be visual, and you'll be able to see them as well as utilize some of them. So for example, the first pod that you will see here highlighted in red is the main screen of the PowerPoint show. And then after that, you will now see that I have two other pods highlighted in red here. One of them is for you to see the question and answer pod, where you can either type in your question in the chat pod or you can also raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, I will go ahead and get your mic on for you so that you will be able to ask your question. And when you're finished, I will go ahead and mute your mic for you. So that option is also available. If there are any issues or technical issues, you will see a button on the upper right-hand corner that gives you the option for technical support. And all you need to do is to go ahead and click on that. What's highlighted right now on your screen is actually dealing with the raise hand button, so I apologize that that didn't get highlighted right away. So again, this little button here is one that you can raise if you have any questions, and I can go ahead and unmute you so that you can ask the questions. Okay, well, I am going to go ahead and turn this over to our presenters. And I believe it was going to start with Leilani, is that correct?
Yes, hi everyone. This is Leilani Endicott, and I am the, I'm trying to go forward here in the slide. Deepa, could you please go forward in the slide to the title slide?
Absolutely. Oh, you want to go back to the title slide?
Yes.
Okay, one second.
So I'm Leilani Endicott, and I worked with many of you in my role as the chair of the Institutional Review Board, and my title is Director of Research Ethics and Compliance, and that's a part of the Center for Research Quality. Welcome. Good morning, everyone. My name is Molly Lauk. I'm a colleague of both of the presenters here, Jenny and Leilani, in the Center for Research Quality. I'm the director of the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs, which is where I spend most of my time helping students and faculty gain access to resources to conduct funded research. And so what falls underneath of that umbrella is gaining access to controlled access or restricted access database sets, which is just one part of what I'm involved with that's most specifically related to the topics we're going to talk about today.
Hi everyone, and I am Jenny Shear. I am the Associate Director in the Office of Research Ethics and Compliance. I predominantly work with Leilani with the IRB, and I also do a lot of more of the working with students right as they come to IRB or answering questions possibly while they're still working on their proposal and helping them understand the feasibility sometimes of what they're doing based on what, depending on where they're doing it, if it's possible to maybe do a secondary analysis or collect new data, just helping them understand various options that are available to them to help them consider as they further develop their topic.
And this is Leilani again. As you can see, there are some other folks listed here as co-presenters, and they're not able to join us this morning. But our center's executive director, Laura Lynn, as well as Lou Milanese, who's the director in the Office of Research Quality Management. And so please also consider them to be good resources and contacts on this topic. Deepa, it won't go past the housekeeping. Would you mind? Thank you. Okay, so today we're interested in sharing with you really an exploration of some of the different opportunities for your students. There are many different options for doctoral studies in terms of generating data, and we especially want to help make you more aware of the various options for accessing data sets, and so that you can be better able to support students in being aware of and exploring all of their options. So we're going to take a bit of a step back in terms of defining what are the types of data that are available for students to use in their doctoral studies, and we'll be sharing a taxonomy. Some of this will be familiar, but we also are finding that as we're talking to different faculty groups, there are some really important pockets of potential doctoral study data sources that many faculty were not aware of, and so we think it's a good idea to keep bringing this message to the faculty members so that they can bring it to their students, and to make sure that students aren't missing opportunities for studies that might be right under their noses in their workplace or in some publicly accessible data set. So we'll be sharing some very specific examples of research data, operational data, and encouraging you to be thinking about existing data sources as well as data sources that are prospective, that would be created in the future by our researcher, or sometimes that data set might be created by another entity. And then operational data is something we'll be talking about quite a bit today, and that is data that's created by any organization as part of its operations. And organizations keep all kinds of records, and really all of that, those records, the data, the information in those records is potentially a rich data source for a doctoral study. And then we'll also be sharing some resources and support that are available at Walden. Okay, so first, we were interested in hearing from you all whether or not you have done much in terms of supervising secondary analyses with your students. And so we're curious whether or not any of you have ever supervised a doctoral study that analyzed school or district records. And if you could raise your hand if you've ever supervised a doctoral study in which a student analyzed records from a school. Okay, looks like none. Have any of you supervised a doctoral study that looked at some other organization's operational records?
And just a reminder, there's a little raise hand button at the top of your screen. So if you have, you just have to click on it and you'll see it.
Thank you, Deepa. Oh, okay. So it looks like a couple people maybe have had their students who've analyzed records. That's great to know. I'm going to ask a couple other questions just to kind of get a sense of what the different types of experiences are in this group. Have any of you supervised, I'm at number 3 now, have any of you supervised a student who analyzed data that was collected by some other research team? Okay, all right, still have a couple. And the next one, have any of you supervised a doctoral study that used a government agency's data set, such as the Centers for Disease Control, National Center for Educational Statistics? Okay, we've got some very experienced folks in this group. And how about this, to be honest, this is the odd one, the kind of rare, less common one. Have any of you supervised a doctoral study that involved an analysis of some organization's records that were not yet created when the student had an approved proposal? All right, so we definitely looks like we have some folks who have experience with that. And then finally, have any of you supervised either a meta-analysis or meta-synthesis where your students analyzed other researchers' findings? Okay, that's great to know. And I'll go ahead and we'll be sharing more examples of these, and certainly if questions arise, go ahead and please type them into the chat pod, and we'll find a moment when we can jump down there and talk about any questions you might have. So, one of the reasons we're bringing this discussion to the faculty is that we have found that we did a study, and we looked at data or doctoral studies over a 3-year period, and we found that 20% of our research at Walden, so that includes all the doctoral studies, faculty research, and everything, 20% of those studies involved some sort of secondary analysis of data that was originally collected for some other reason. And an additional 25% of those studies used a secondary analysis of some sort of non-research data combined with data that the researcher collected just for the purposes of that study. So that, to us, tells us that at least half of our researchers are engaged in some sort of secondary analysis. And given our scholar-practitioner model at Walden, it makes sense that perhaps even more could be, and maybe even should be, taking advantage of all the data that's right under their noses in their workplace, or perhaps in publicly available databases. We're trying to keep this discussion very broad, but there are some things to consider about secondary analyses and analyzing data that was created for some reason other than research. There often are fewer risks and delays regarding IRB when the student is simply accessing a database that's created for some reason other than research. We often find that if the student is well prepared, the whole data collection process is often expedited a great deal, and in many cases it's possible, and I'm going to try to be very careful and use the language I use here. In some cases it is possible for the data to be collected before the proposal is approved or the IRB approval occurs. That's a very limited set of circumstances, and I'll be sharing some examples of that. But in some cases, it's possible to use, the past several years worth of data that an organization has been generating. It's, say, part of its educational records or clinical records. And so in many cases, if the student explores their options early on, the whole doctoral study process is able to have a streamlined, a more streamlined timeline. We're also aware that there seems to be some bias, not across the board, but there are pockets of bias among faculty and students who feel perhaps mistakenly that it's better to collect your own data than to use data that's already existing. And given the scholar-practitioner model at Walden, which is that we're trying to train doctoral students to apply research skills in a practitioner setting, we definitely want to do all that we can to help students develop the skills and the expertise to use data that is already part of the workplace. And so we want to put that bias up front in this discussion area for all of us to be thinking about. There certainly are times when it's better to collect fresh data than to use data that's just maybe sitting in some database or some computer at an organization or in some other research team's records. But we want to try to put that bias up front, and so we can engage students in talking about it and help each student critically examine their options. So if they've got a couple data sets available to them, say in their workplace or publicly available, as well as the option of creating their own data, we would want them to really make a well-informed decision rather than automatically assuming that it's better for them to collect their own fresh data. And then I think the theme of this presentation is simply we want our students and we want our students to consider all of the options, and so that's why we're trying to help put a lot of these options up in front of you all. Okay, so these are all sort of pros or advantages of secondary analysis. There are also a couple cautions to be aware of, and that is, we'll be talking about that a little bit toward the end of this presentation. There are some complexities, and in some cases, just feasibility challenges. And so, in particular, with data sets, large data sets that are already created, and our researcher maybe has no option of exerting any influence over how the records are analyzed. So we're going to talk a bit about what some of the limitations are of a secondary analysis. And just to let you know, as we've been bringing this material in front of all the faculty, we've gotten lots of great feedback, and we're working right now on a primer that would be directed partly at students, partly to be available for faculty. But we want to try to make these options more plainly accessible and understandable for novice researchers, considering that for many of them, this is just their first or second study they've ever done, this doctoral study. Okay, and so in this part of the session, we wanted to ask everyone to set aside some of your biases for a moment about what a data set is, or what is data, what are data. And we all have preconceived notions. I think if you think of the term data set, often some of us picture a spreadsheet of some sort, right? Maybe because that's what we were first exposed to in our maybe undergrad training or graduate school training. And that's just one tiny slice of the pie. A spreadsheet with numbers, or a spreadsheet with even words, is just one type of data. And so if we can step back from that for a moment and consider that data that could possibly be used in research includes really any type of information in any format. It can be numbers, it could be words, it could be artifacts, it could be recordings, it could be photographs, it could be, it's really an endless array of possibilities. And so what makes research data different from that infinite list of information is research data is characterized by these three things. Research data does need to have been systematically generated or obtained, because we expect researchers to demonstrate that they are using a systematic method of analysis. And so how that data is created or obtained is part of the systematic method. We also expect researchers to do a critical evaluation of the data and to address any limitations in the data set, any irregularities. Maybe that's a bit much to get into right now, but this is one of the things that we will explain more in our data primer that we'll be sharing soon. And we also expect that researchers will use information that is clearly aligned to the research questions that are developed. And so, there's a tension here. We want our students to be aware of many, many possibilities for different types of data that they can include in their doctoral study, as long as that data can be addressed and described along these three dimensions. So we're kind of saying anything goes as long as it meets these criteria. And so students have several different opportunities in the doctoral study to apply the data. The data can be used very early on, in many cases, to develop the research questions. I know many of you work with students even when they're identifying a research problem, to bring forward statistics and information about why is this research problem important. And sometimes students bring data of some sort, often in the form of aggregate statistics that are publicly available, but students, a very, very, very small number of students actually collect some data, like maybe they do some interviews or surveying in order to develop the research questions. And I'll put on my IRB chair hat for just a moment to say, yes, if they collect data in these early phases, they do need IRB approval. It's not a problem if they don't yet have an approved proposal, but just they would need IRB approval to collect any type of data at this early phase. And then the second bullet is kind of what we're all used to as the standard use of data to answer the research question. This typically happens, well, not typically, this always happens after proposal approval, though sometimes our students, have a sense of how the research question will be answered even before the proposal is approved. But technically and formally speaking, the answering the research question with data happens after proposal approval. And at Walden, we do require IRB review and approval for every doctoral study, and it's built into the flow of the proposal process. And finally, students are able to use research data in order to elaborate on the results, to interpret the results. And one example is when sometimes students have their data, they've already addressed the research question, and perhaps they would use the demographic information to better interpret and to describe the context of their findings. Okay, so I'm just sort of glancing through the chat pod to see if any questions have come up, and I don't see any. And yes, we will definitely be making this slide deck available to share.
And I see that Anne has her hand raised, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute her microphone for you.
Hi, Anne. Please go ahead. Or you could type your question if you're having any challenges with the mic.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Ah, there we go. You mentioned, I'll have to scroll up, about students collecting data before the proposal is approved need an IRB approval. I'm thinking of a student I'm working with right now who was handed cases, literally, boxes and boxes of data that she has not analyzed, hasn't really looked at much because there's so much of it, but that she was handed it by the mayor of this town. She didn't plan on it. It just happened. So any suggestions on how we can address that? Does it need to be addressed with IRB? My bells started ringing when you mentioned that.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Anne. That's a wonderful question, and that's an excellent example of existing data that's eligible for any of these applications in the doctoral study. And I think maybe we could talk more offline about the specific case, but in a general sense, if a student either has a set of data handed to them, or in some other cases, it's something they have access to as part of their job. Does she work for the city?
No.
Okay. So yeah, because that would make the example a little bit different. So in the case where it's an unaffiliated type of, someone is just willing to share the data, we would expect that the student have some sort of memo, even if it's just a very simple email saying, I support you using this data in your doctoral study. That's sort of the minimal amount of documentation. And another issue is whether or not this data is available to anyone who asks, or whether the mayor just decided that this particular student would be allowed to access the data. So that's one of the things that we would need to talk about further. If it's something that the mayor actually would be happy to share with anyone, we would consider that to be publicly available data. And generally speaking, we always encourage, or I should just say we require that students check in with us for their individual case. So I try not to make blanket statements that could maybe be misconstrued, but it sounds at this point like this is something the student could be very welcome to use at this phase without any particular approvals if this is some data that anybody would be allowed to have access to. If, however, the mayor is just giving sole access to this one student, then we would need to do an IRB approval, and I would anticipate no problem with that.
And that would have to be done before the proposal, during that proposal development stage?
Well, and here's an important pragmatic challenge, is that we wouldn't want students to get the impression that they're never allowed to look at data before proposal approval or even IRB approval, because that's a tricky thing, right? How can I develop a proposal around a data set and I have no idea what's in it? I have no idea if the variables are what I think they are, or if I have, depending on whether it's quantitative or qualitative data, I don't know the scope of this data set. And so, yes, I would say in this particular student's case, maybe have her email to the IRB a description of what's in the box, what is this data set, and then we can give her more specific guidance. But we would definitely encourage students to either, well, we would encourage them, of course, to use it to answer a research question. And if she needs to conduct some analyses in order just to articulate, to develop her research question, most likely that's fine, but it would be good for us to just all double check and make sure she's sort of on the record that she's, checked that her access is.
In this case, access is only for her, so I will,
Okay.
I'll touch base with you later so we don't take a whole lot of time, and have her, she has a memo of support from the mayor who's
Wonderful.
like a big cheerleader, but I just don't want this to get hung up after the fact, so I'll be in touch.
Exactly. Wonderful. And thank you for sharing that example. And just to, briefly explore a different direction, hypothetically, what if this student worked in the city office and she had access to this data as part of her job? That's a very common occurrence at Walden. And again, it ties right into our scholar practitioner model. Then we still would need some sort of memo that the student is, that they support the student using this data for research purposes, for the purposes of the doctoral study. And this is a question we get every day, and it's just good for us all to have that dialogue with the student and confirm it in writing. And sometimes the students feel very nervous about this too, because they've been hearing for as long as they've been in a doctoral program, don't collect data without IRB approval, and so they don't want to, do a misstep. And so we definitely want to make sure they don't perceive more barriers than they actually are, and so it's always best if they check in directly with us.
That's great.
Thanks, Anne.
Thank you.
Okay, and so I've kind of alluded to all of these at some point so far as we've been talking, so let me give you some more concrete definitions of what I mean by research data versus operational data, and then in a moment I'm going to show you a chart kind of laying it all out, and it has a few examples. So we've been talking about all the different types of data that are eligible, if you will, to be included in a doctoral study. And as we've been working with so many different scholar practitioners over the years, we've noted a taxonomy, and we think that this will be helpful in trying to convey to students what are all of the options available to you. And so the first dimension in the taxonomy is what was the original purpose for creating the data. And so traditionally, a lot of us who maybe were trained in lab settings or maybe traditional experimental research types of programs, we learned how to design research procedures to collect data that is specifically and only collected for research purposes. And this is sort of the bullet that reflects traditional experimental research data collected for research purposes. Applied research is often conducted using the second bullet, operational data, data that is it's created, it's generated for some purpose other than research, and then researchers make use of this operational data. So this is a really important dimension given Walden's scholar practitioner model. And so, like I said, we'll show you a chart with some more examples in just a moment. The other dimension that we've noted is that in some cases the data is already existing, and in many other cases it doesn't yet exist, but the organization or the research team will be creating the data in the future. And so this can sometimes be confusing for students, like as Anne mentioned, because we drill it into their heads that no, you shouldn't collect data before IRB approval. But there are some cases, especially when the organization is generating the data as part of its regular operations for its own purposes. There are many cases when it's all right if the data has already been collected, or even that the data will be collected in the future as part of the operations of the organization. And then also just to highlight, the traditional model of experimental research data is that the data is collected prospectively in the future for research purposes. And so what we're saying is that it's possible even for operational data to be collected in the future. It doesn't have to be already existing. And then the final dimension, which I think all of you are already familiar with, is data can be qualitative or quantitative. And that doesn't make any difference at all for approvals, but often if you just remind students that there are many dimensions of qualitative and quantitative data, it helps them explore all the possible options. Okay, so here's the chart I kept promising. This is something, it's not an exhaustive chart. This could be potentially a very long chart, and so we just wanted to include a few examples, and at some point, perhaps in our primer that we'll be sharing here in the coming months, we can have a more exhaustive list of different types of examples. So the primary dimensions we're showing here are data collected for research purposes versus data that's originally generated for operational purposes. And by operational purposes, what I mean is that the organization generates the data as part of whatever that organization does, whether it's education, healthcare, a government agency has its mission, military units. Every organization out there has data, many different types of data. And so the other dimension that we're showing here is kind of laying out what are some examples of research data that is maybe already existing, of research data that would be collected. And I want to just point out that this column here, the second column, is the more traditional approach to experimental research, or not even just experimental research, but the model in which the student generates data just for research purposes. And then on these two columns, we just wanted to tease apart and show some examples of different types of operational data that may already be in existence versus data that might be collected in the future. So let's look at some of these examples. All right, so existing research data is any type of data that other researchers have collected for research purposes and that our student can access. And I wasn't sure, Anne, I'm not sure if your mic is still on, but do you know if in that example, if the mayor originally collected the data for research purposes, or was it for some other type of record keeping or operation?
Am I connected now? Yes.
Yes.
Actually, it was a disaster. The disaster where the federal government came in and closed the town and kicked everybody out and relocated them. So she collected it for posterity, and it was not for research. It was just for records. They're records, and she just couldn't think of anything else to do, so she collected them and stuck them in her basement, and then handed the boxes to my student.
I see. Okay, so it sounds
intention of sharing them with anyone else. So
sure, and so it sounds like it was originally between these two. It does not sound like it was this mayor was undertaking a research project, but that in part of her role as mayor, she was documenting, perhaps with. And this will be a challenge for the student to figure out how systematic was this data collection, this creation of data. And if it turns out that it was somewhat systematic, or even if she can systematically go through and cull data, I hate to keep using that word systematically, but with a rigorous system, then it would qualify potentially for being used in a doctoral study as as an example of existing operational data.
Yeah.
Okay, so I wasn't sure if it would fit here or here, so I want to kind of take these in order. So other researchers who have shared their entire data sets, they do so for a variety of reasons. And in a moment, Jenny and Molly will be talking about, the procedures for accessing some of those data sets. And in any case, when researchers publish their data, that gives all of us something that can be subjected to either meta-analysis, if it's quantitative results, or even potentially metasynthesis, if the results are more qualitative or are a mix of qualitative and quantitative results. And there are also many researchers that maybe they don't put their data into a database that's publicly, one-click accessible, but there are many researchers out there who are willing to sign over an entire data set to a doctoral student. I was a very fortunate doctoral student that a research team who'd been collecting longitudinal data for 5 years just signed data over to me for my dissertation. It's something, and sometimes our students are able to work with a faculty member, someone at Walden, who's able to share an archive of research data. So those are just some examples of quantitative analysis of existing research data. They are also examples where researchers may share qualitative data with our students. The perspective data I won't say too much about, because those are, that's the traditional model in which the data that will be generated in the future solely for research purposes. So if you think about interviews that are just serving a research purpose, or perhaps surveys or some sort of paper and pencil assessment or online assessment. And so this is what our IRB system and our proposal review system is set up very well for right now. So let's talk a bit more about the operational data. And the existing data, like Anne's examples, anything that some organization has created or some individual person has created for some reason other than this doctoral study or this research study. And some examples would be operational records from any business, any military unit, government agency, medical care, health care, or even mental health care, client data, as long as it's de-identified. That's another point that would be really important for us to explore with Anne's student, is whether or not there are identifiers in that data set that maybe would be best redacted before being subjected to analysis. And certainly public records are eligible for analysis as existing operational data. And we also see quite a few studies in which a student wishes to analyze artifacts that are generated by the organization. So student work products, and maybe the student will apply some sort of rubric to analyzing and assessing the student work products, or even employee cases or employee work products, internal documents, policies, recordings, and minutes of meetings. We had a student do a really brilliant dissertation doing discourse analysis of one of the Wisconsin Native tribes leadership meetings and what type of discourse was used in decision making. And that's a really brilliant example of analysis of existing operational data. Photos and video. Here's one we get a lot of questions about: online dialogue, whether it's in a not chat room, but like a discussion board, or even sometimes online classrooms. There are many cases in which it's possible to do an analysis of past online classroom discourse. The tricky part is removing the identifiers, but we actually have a Walden scholar who's written a program for removing the identifiers from entire large data sets. So ask us about that if that's something you or your students are curious about. And just to transition over to this final column, it's also possible to look at future online dialogue. So it's possible if a researcher is in a position to set up some sort of online dialogue, whether it's in a classroom or discussion board, and that they would then expect in the future to collect that data to analyze that data as part of their doctoral study. We would explore with the student what are the various uses of this data, and if research is the primary purpose of the data, it would go into this column, and that's where you need informed consent. It's sort of the traditional model of you cannot do it until after proposal approval, but if the original purpose, or the primary purpose of the data is not the doctoral study, if you look at some of these examples, then it's possible for the student to go ahead and work with the other organization to collect the data, and perhaps even for the researcher to have some input on how that data is organized and generated in order for it to be more appropriate for research analysis. So here's some examples. Some quantitative examples would be if we've got a student who's a part of an organization in which a big change is about to happen, or maybe a big intervention is about to be implemented, and the student wants to be tracking information over time, and this intervention is not going to happen until in the future. So it's not an existing data set, it's a prospective data set. This type of data, the student can work with the organization to determine what type of assessments are appropriate within that organization to just be monitoring this change over time, and this often provides very rich data potentially for a doctoral study. It's possible, we've had some students who collect prospective user statistics and data generated by websites and by online classrooms and things like that. Some qualitative examples, I think I already mentioned the future online dialogue, student work products that might be generated in the future, employee cases or employee outcomes that might be occurring in the future. Those are also eligible. And I'm going to go to the next slide, because the next slide shows what are the criteria for this last column. Okay, so when I mentioned that IRB would need to work with a student to figure out, is this appropriate for an analysis? We don't want to encourage students to just do a backdoor, oh yeah, I teach in a classroom, and I'm going to give I'm interested in studying anxiety, so I'm going to give all of my students an anxiety assessment and just, make that part of my classroom procedures. No, that doesn't really sound like something teachers do on a regular basis. And so it sounds that would be an example of a backdoor where we would say, no, student, that doesn't sound appropriate. That's not something that would typically be done in a classroom or in a school. So in order for it not to be a subjective willy-nilly process, we have these 6 questions that we would ask each student, and we would work with them on answering these questions. They don't have to figure it out on their own. But a secondary analysis of an operational data set would be appropriate if each of these questions is answered with a yes. And the very first question is the most important one, and that is, aside from your study, would the data be directly used by the organization in some way that will directly benefit the organization? For example, is that organization going to use it as part of their staff development, maybe to write a grant proposal, or maybe part of their ongoing continuous improvement or giving feedback to their employees? There's got to be, in order for a secondary analysis to work, especially when we're talking about a student who's essentially conducting a study in their own organization, it needs to be clear that this is not just for the purpose of the doctoral study, that there must be direct applicability of this data for the researcher. It needs to be something that's appropriate to be, this type of data needs to be appropriate to be collected under the organization's own policies and procedures. So that's when I mentioned the example about anxiety assessments in the classroom. That's kind of on the border. Definitely not appropriate if we're referring to a clinical anxiety assessment. But maybe a case could be made if a teacher is worried about testing anxiety. I mean, there have been some some situations where we just sort of work it out with the student, and if it seems appropriate, then it can qualify as a secondary analysis. And then the issue of a de-identification, that's a really important aspect. All secondary analyses identifiers need to be removable from the data set. And then finally, whoever is the gatekeeper or the owner, so to speak, of the data set needs to be comfortable signing over the data. And it could be a formal data use agreement like we have posted on our IRB website, or it could, in many cases, it's appropriate if it's an email memo from whoever owns that data and for them to express their support for this data to be used in the doctoral study. And then these last two are for special situations, if there is, if the researcher is involved in adjusting or tweaking the organization's typical data collection or data tracking, then we would just need for the organization to confirm in writing that they are assuming oversight of that data tracking. So let me go back to the example of math, well, not math, but testing anxiety. If a student came to us and said, yes, I plan to use test anxiety assessment in my classroom to help students be more aware of, their testing anxiety and to help them overcome those challenges. And okay, that sounds pretty convincing. We would ask the school to document that they're comfortable with that type of test anxiety assessment being given in the classroom. If it were, let's say, some sort of clinical anxiety, looking at eating disorders or looking more at clinical manifestations of anxiety, it's not likely that a school would say, yes, you're allowed to give that out in a classroom and administer a clinical assessment. That's just going too far beyond what the typical operations of a school would be. And even as I'm saying this, I'm realizing there may be some exceptions in special education, but those would be things that the students should explore with us. And then finally, if there's any type of intervention or program involved in this doctoral study, we do need to document that the organization is assuming oversight for that intervention. And Jenny, would you like to add anything here? Jenny, as she mentioned, she's one of the frontline individuals who works with students in determining these sorts of things for IRB.
Yeah, thanks. Just a couple of quick things, especially for subpart C. This is one that often trips students up because they're wanting to do sometimes a pre and post. They might, using the math anxiety example or test anxiety example, sometimes some students want to explore whether test anxiety is higher at the end of the semester compared to the beginning of the semester, and they get hung up on the fact that, well, I need an identifier to compare those pre and post scores, and that's completely understandable. What we definitely want to highlight with point C is that end data set is once that data set has been generated, is it possible to remove those identifiers, which if a study is consisting solely of that analysis of that operational data, then yes, it would be very possible to remove that data. What gets a little tricky sometimes is when students want to have a study where maybe they're comparing some type of operational data, maybe the student-specific test score to a survey that they want to administer or interview data. That's where it gets to be a little bit more tricky, and so we definitely wanted to highlight that even if the data set currently has identifiers, it's looking to see is it a way to redact that information. And then just the other thing I really wanted to highlight with these litmus questions is they are an excellent opportunity for students that are kind of in this gray area if they're not sure whether their study needs to be considered more collecting new data versus a secondary analysis of operational data, to begin having that conversation with the proposed community partner at an early stage. It's not uncommon for organizations to have a lot of great feedback to help the student identify what some pragmatic options are for the student when it comes to conducting their study. And unfortunately, a lot of students seem to think that they have to wait clear to the very end of their proposal to contact the community partner, which really isn't the case. We encourage students to contact organizations really early on, just to even determine if that community partner would be willing to let the study be done, but also, again, to work with them as a true partnership in finding ways that the study can really ultimately benefit the community partner based on what their overall needs are. So these questions can really be a great starting point for these types of students to help them and clarify what direction their study may ultimately take. Thanks, Jenny. So if you have a student in a scenario where it looks like they might have access to some data in their workplace or through someone they know, like this mayor, please send them to IRB and we can start the dialogue. The contact information will be at the end of the slideshow. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but this sort of recaps what we've been talking about, some of the advantages and challenges of doing a secondary analysis of existing data. And then I'll hand it back over to Jenny. Okay, great. Thank you. At Walden, we do really support students that are wanting to do studies that consist of secondary analyses. One of the major, and Leilani hinted at this earlier, that a secondary analysis, that type of data can come from a myriad different sources. There's no one place those types of things can come, but often trying to find the right data set can be a challenge in and of itself. And especially for some students, if they're wanting to research a particularly sensitive topic, pursuing a secondary analysis might be an effective way to research a topic that would really, really be difficult under other circumstances, especially given the fact that it is a student's dissertation or final capstone, and they often have a limited time frame. They don't have 5 or 6 years to collect data on things, and so secondary analysis can kind of find a middle ground. And one such resource is this ICPSR. It's the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Science Research. And it is a repository that's actually housed at the University of Michigan, and it holds hundreds of thousands of data sets that researchers have made available over the years, and they are continually adding to it. And Walden has actually joined this consortium, and so students and faculty actually have access to these databases by nature of being affiliated with Walden. They would just need to create an account with ICPSR, and they would be able to access. And some of the data sets on ICPSR are readily available. Not much more is needed, and some are considered to be restricted or controlled access. And if that's the case, we are still willing to work with students. It just might take a few extra steps in order to get approval to get the data from the owners of the data. They just want a few more assurances that even with those restricted data sets, we do have the infrastructure to help those students kind of navigate what needs to be done. And then another big resource is the Social Change Impact Report data sets. And this is something that actually Walden has made available. And more information about this is available on the Center for Research Quality section of the website. And I will just put a little blurb in right now that our website is currently undergoing some construction. And so I'm not entirely certain when our website will be fully. We're transitioning to a different layout, and I'm not entirely certain when that's done. So it might be a little difficult to find information about some of these sources at this point, but certainly if you're not able to find it on the website, please don't hesitate to contact us, and we can get you in touch with what it is that you're looking for until it's a little bit clearer on our website. And then this final one, this data sources and support, is more of a tutorial that is in the works. This is something that Lou Milanese and his office is working on, and is definitely something to really help identify some of those challenges from the previous screen of helping students understand what they need to consider about the usefulness of the data set. Is it in the right format? does it have the right variables for the study, those types of things. It's not uncommon for a bit of extra work to be needed before a data set is really eligible to be used to be able to even answer a research question. And so that's something that will be coming out in the next few months. And then again, just the rest of the links we've discussed before. There's just so many different ways that data sets can be accessed. And if you ever get to the point where you have a student that is wanting to do something and they have questions, please don't ever hesitate to have them contact us, so that way we can help, if we need to, provide any additional information or support to get them into that.
Jenny, did we lose you? Okay,
No,
we'll move on to control. That's okay, your mic disappeared for a second. I just want to add about ICPSR and understanding that that's a consortium that owns a repository of data collected by other researchers that are affiliated with the consortium. Whereas the Social Change Impact Report datasets, that's data that Walden University owns. We hired Harris Interactive to do national and international studies, conduct surveys around the world about perceptions of social change. And our colleague Lou Melanese loves to say there are a lot of very ripe, low-hanging fruit that would make excellent doctoral studies and dissertations. So once that information is all been put together, it's just not transitioned to the new website, but once it's there, the CRQ website, you'll be able to take a look at that, and there's a lot of good information. I realize that we're at the top of the hour, so I just very quickly want to make the point that we've been talking about accessing data sets, and Anne, you gave a great example of a student where a data set that's existing operational data just kind of fell into this student's lap, but there's still a process of accessing use of it. And while that is a little bit more informal, the student and you will still make use of Leilani's office to help do that negotiation. There's lots of, I love that example because there's lots of different types of data in many different institutions, and some of them will have very informal processes for gaining access to them, and others will have very formal, rigorous, structured ones. Lots of times we call this controlled access or restricted access data, and that can put students and faculty off from the idea of gaining access to it. We have very successfully helped students and faculty negotiate access to very restricted database sets at the National Institutes of Health. These are large quantitative data sets that are primarily health related, but we've also done some with the CDC. We've had a student go to courthouses to gain access to fire records in a number of Northeast states. Again, that may not have been as restricted as the NIH or have a process that is well established as the NIH, but when you find yourself or your student facing questions about how to negotiate access to a data set, you have three places that you can really reach out to. One, the IRB is often the first go-to spot. You can always go to my office, which is grants@waldenu.edu, and you can also go to Dataset Access at waldenu.edu, where a whole myriad of topics are covered. And Jenny and I are both checking that roll account daily, and if you start there or you start with the IRB's office, you start with my office, we'll get you and your student to where you need to be at the end. I think one just cautionary note before we let you go here is that we really want to help our students understand so that they're not surprised that using an existing data set doesn't necessarily mean that it comes prepackaged and ready to be implemented for the specific purposes of the student or the faculty's research. This is usually students who are surprised that when they realize that, you know, the data needs to be cleaned, or it needs to be organized, or it needs to be coded in a way that aligns with what their own proposed research is for their own analysis of this existing data set to answer their own research questions. So just a note to pay forward, because we have unfortunately had a number of students who struggle when they get the data set and they're overwhelmed by the work that's needed to get it organized. And they do it, and it all works out in the end, but it might take a little more time than they initially anticipate. So thanks for staying the last couple of minutes with us. These are the support resources. Two of them I mentioned, the Dataset Access, the grants at Walden.edu. Leilani and Jenny have mentioned IRB. There's also methodology advice at waldenu.edu, which is just for faculty. That's a place where faculty can reach out and ask questions about methodology, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, and you could even start with your existing data questions there and again be triaged to the right place in the end. So unless anybody has any questions, I'm welcome to hang out for a minute and answer questions, or you can shoot any of us emails at these addresses that we've put on the website. Otherwise, thank you very much for spending the hour with us talking about something that we're very excited about.
Thank you, everybody, for attending today. And just a quick little housekeeping reminder that all of this information has been recorded, and you will receive an email from CFE, and the email will, embedded within the email, you will see a link for the slideshow as well as for the recording. So you'll have access to it, and as always, all the webinars are archived in the CFE with the Walden University website. So once again, thanks everybody, and have a great day. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.